1 Timothy chapter 1, read with me verses 1 and 2. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the commandment of God our Savior, and the Lord Jesus Christ our hope. To Timothy, a true son in the faith, grace, mercy, and peace from God our Father and Jesus Christ our Lord. This is a pretty standard introduction if you compared Timothy and Titus and Ephesians and others. A typical greeting, but it's not just a rote repetition by Paul. When we even look at these few words, even though this is not the focus of the study this morning, here Paul offers a simple reminder of who God is and of the things that God offers and gives to His people, and then reminds Timothy that he's writing not as Paul the friend, Paul the neighbor, but Paul the apostle. That's the foundation of everything that he is going to say. And so of the work that God gave the apostles, and in this case Paul, the specific work that he gave him to do. On that basis then, verses 3 and 4, he says, "As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which cause disputes, rather than godly edification, which is in faith." I don't know the exact timing of when Paul wrote this, and so what were the precise fables and endless genealogies? We could go back to Acts 19. Paul was in Ephesus there, and we could read about Diana of the Ephesians, and so it could be some of the Greek myths. The Jews also, though, had some of their myths, and for other reasons, the genealogies that they tracked and thought much about. Paul says here that he urged Timothy to stay in Ephesus, and so was Timothy wanting to leave with Paul and go to where the next place? Was Timothy fearful or discouraged or frustrated with these other teachings and the influence that they were having? I don't know, but Paul had to urge him. Paul urged him to stay there, despite the disputes and other desires that he describes here. And part of the assignment, the rest of 1 Timothy is the fullness of it. But as he begins this letter, he says, "Timothy, one of the reasons I need you to stay is to command some to teach no other doctrine, and then command them not to give heed to any of these other distracting teachings and ideas." So, first of all, notice the importance of doctrine in the work of Paul. Again, not just Paul, the man who lived in Tarsus, not just Paul the Jew. Those are minor details, just as we have our own minor details. But Paul the apostle, doctrine was something of importance to him, and it was something of importance enough to Timothy that, assuming Timothy would comply with what Paul urged him to do, Timothy would remain in Ephesus because they had Jesus as the model. Jesus wanted there to be peace. He's called the Prince of Peace. But when he came, doctrine was a part of what Jesus did, of what he spent his time doing, and of what he was trying to bring peace by. And so doctrine is a large part of the book of 1 Timothy, and that's true of everything that is there. All of it is teaching. For some reason, the word doctrine sometimes is viewed differently today, that, certain teachings are doctrines. People today have various opinions about what doctrine is, and churches even invent their own doctrines. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, though, Paul says, he's urging Timothy to stay in Ephesus. On another occasion, he was sending Timothy to Corinth, and he was telling the Corinthians, "I want you to receive him, because he's going to bring the same message to you that I brought to you, and the same message I brought to you is what I bring to every church." The same message in every church. That's a rather novel idea, so to speak, at least from our society today. In our society, you might visit different churches to find the doctrine that you believe or that you want. And when Paul was teaching, wherever he was, it was the same doctrine everywhere and in every church. So Paul's thinking is clear Timothy, go and command them that there should be no other doctrine. No other teaching is permitted. And so what would Timothy tell them when he went there? Teach no other doctrine, give heed, listen to no other doctrine. So in other words, at least some of the things you are teaching, you've got to stop teaching that. Or if you're not a teacher, you're a hearer, well, you've got to pay enough attention so that you recognize what you don't need to hear, what you don't need to listen to, what should not be taught. So while the book of 1 Timothy is primarily written to Timothy because of his work as an evangelist, here from the beginning, it's not just a book for evangelists, because what Paul was telling Timothy to teach everyone applied to everyone, teacher, whether their work was primarily teaching or listening. They each had a responsibility. But again, whatever these myths were or these genealogies, that isn't all that Timothy was going to be teaching. We're not going to study the entirety of this book this morning, but everything else that Paul tells Timothy here is simply inform Timothy what he needs to teach, and then what everybody needs to listen to, give heed to, put into practice. And then once you've heard it enough and practiced it enough, then in some way, then you're prepared and ready to teach it as well. Next to verse 5, which is really going to be our focus, Paul gives Timothy this commandment that he wants Timothy to give some commandments. So Paul commands Timothy to give some commands to the Ephesians, but what's the point? What is the purpose of what Paul is commanding Timothy? And what's the purpose of what Timothy is going to command or instruct the Ephesians? That's explained this way in verse 5. Now, the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith. I want to focus for a moment on the word purpose here, the purpose of the commandment. Now, purpose might mean the motivation, what the commandment is coming from, or why someone is giving the command. But in this case, it's more the opposite, the other end of that. The purpose in this case means the goal, the end, the result that God is looking for. This is the focus of the command. And so the goal of everything that Timothy was going to say, whether it was in addressing the teachers and what they needed to not teach, or those who were listening and what they should not pay attention to, there's a goal for all of that, the purpose of all of that. And Timothy needed to not only understand what to say, but also why he was going to say those things. And that would apply again to these myths and genealogies, but that would apply to everything else that Timothy was taught by Paul. And that would apply to everything that God commands us. Everything, the end, the goal of every command that God gives us is that there would be love, and that love would grow from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. And so that's the goal of the commandment. And again, what commandment is he talking about? I think he's talking about the commandment that he was giving to Timothy, that Timothy was to give to them. And so these instructions that he's describing here, and of course those commandments don't belong to Timothy. He's passing them on, but Timothy has received those commands from Paul. But are the commands really Paul's? Well, no, back to verse 1, Paul is just an apostle of Jesus Christ. And so the commandments are ultimately the Lord's. So how did Paul know what purpose or what result that God had for the commandments that God gave, and that God gave to him, and that he was to give to Timothy, and that Timothy was to give to others? How did Paul know what the goal was, what the end result is that God had in mind for those commandments? And again, that points back to his work as an apostle. Only by God revealing his mind could Paul know anything. Could he know what to teach and what to command others. But the goal here that he has, and the goal that he wants Timothy to have, is the goal that God first had in giving these instructions. The commandments should produce a pure heart. The commandments will produce a good conscience. The commandments will produce sincere faith. And when there is a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith, then what grows from that? Well, he says love. Love is the outgrowth of all of those things. So I want to look at each one of these, beginning with a pure heart. The purpose of the command, the goal or the end of the commandment, the result that God is looking for from the commandment is that there would be a pure heart. In the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, that was one of the things that Jesus said. Among those, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And so commandments have the purpose of changing a heart so that it is pure and then grows in that purity. And of course the opposite of pure would be dirty or defiled. And so the challenge of the heart is that that's something that no one else can see. You can hide many things in your heart. You can decide not to tell anyone about something you did, something you thought about, and if it never comes out of your mouth, then it's going to be very, very difficult for others to know that it's there. So there's a unique challenge of our hearts, but of course our hearts are open and visible to God, and so God gives these commandments that can affect something that how would I know how to affect your heart? Well, how do I even know what's in your heart? I can't. Sometimes even the preacher, you may get too much credit for the effect and the influence of a lesson. Well, what does the preacher know? He's simply giving the commandments. God is the giver of the heart and of the word that can have an effect there. In 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1, the word purity doesn't appear here, but I think you'll see it deals with a pure heart. Paul says, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves or purify ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. So just as Paul was doing here, Timothy's job was to help them to cleanse themselves of all filthiness. And so there would be some convincing that had to happen. Timothy would need to convince them, well, here is what purity is. And then they might need to be convinced of what defilement is, of what is unclean. And there might need to be some rebuke in that process. Convince and rebuke. And then as Paul says here, don't just put off the filth, but also perfect holiness. That would be convince, rebuke, and then exhort. He would need to exhort them. If you're going to put some things off, well, then that needs to be replaced with something. Replace it with purity of heart or perfecting holiness. And then a heart responds to that. There's only two ways. If he says put these things off and put these other things on, there's only two ways to react to that. Those who would grow in purity, whether it's those in Corinth or back to what Paul was telling Timothy, if there were some who were giving these, teaching these myths or these genealogies, then that was already having an effect in Ephesus. He says it was causing disputes. It was sometimes the result of someone whose desires was they just mainly wanted to be a teacher. That was the role that they were too fixated on. And so there is divisions, and so the consequences of those teachings could be seen. But Paul is saying, Timothy, command them, give them the commandments that will provide pureness of heart. That would have the opposite effect of what was going on there. Pureness of heart, instead of causing disputes, differences, disagreements, and division, the commandments that produce a pure heart then would produce unity, the same kind of ideas and the same kind of heart. Go over to Titus chapter 3. We can do the same. The myths, fables, whatever the genealogies were that they were so fixated on, there was a fruit, there was an end, there was a result to that. And so while those same things may not be may not have been or today be the things we wrestle with. In Titus chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, we can do the same, though. We can look back on the fruit, the results of whatever things we have lived in the past, or even maybe what we struggle with in the present. Paul says to Titus to remind them to speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men. For we ourselves were also once foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving various lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful, and hating one another. And so you can find yourself there in the past, maybe even in the present. But if you'll give a little bit of reflection to that, you can see the direction that it took you when you were walking in those things. And then you can even, to some degree, with your imagination, hit the fast forward button. If I had stayed where I once was, I can see where it got me, and I can see where it would have continued to take me. Or then I can compare that with, but if I did not continue in that, and if I am not continuing in that, look how different the result has been. Look at the end. Look at the goal. Look at what has been accomplished by the commandments. And by no means are we finished or complete or done in our growth, but we can compare those two. And so Timothy was to go to Ephesus and help them to compare the two. Here's what the myths and genealogies are producing. But here there's a commandment that will bring pureness of heart, and that's going to bring very different results. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, where Paul lists just a series of things, whatever things are true, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, the word pure is there. Whatever things are pure, he says, meditate on these things. And what would be the fruit of that? What would be the result of meditating on those things? Well, meditating on pure things is going to result in a pure heart. And so a heart that is growing in purity is a heart that the ground, the soil, the heart is being tilled and the heart is being prepared. And what's going to grow out of the ground of a pure heart? Well, love is from a pure heart. And what's underneath the pure heart, or what's maybe the fertilizer of that? It's the commandment. The commandment produces the pure heart, and the pure heart produces love, but not the purity of heart alone. Paul also says, give them these commandments so that there will be love from a good conscience. The word conscience, you can see in that word science. Science meaning knowledge. The word conscience just means that we are with knowledge. There's this knowledge that is with us. It's the awareness of how my inward decisions compare to what I know or believe to be true, and how my outward decisions compare with what I know or believe to be true. It's this knowledge of myself. And so Timothy, you're going to go, Paul says, you're going to give some commandments, you're going to instruct them in a way that will urge them to live with a good conscience, to be able to compare themselves to what they have believed and see, does it fit? Is it the same? Or is it different? Now, there is a time where we could live with a good conscience while we don't know the truth. We can sin with a good conscience for some amount of time if we are ignorant of the truth. But in the case of Paul sending Timothy to Ephesus, or telling him to remain there, he wasn't speaking to people who were ignorant of these things for the most part. He was dealing, I think the point is, with God's people. And so Timothy was going to be talking to people who had knowledge. They had at least some knowledge, but now they're caught in these contradicting myths, or these contradicting genealogies that don't fit with what God had revealed. And so in order to have a good conscience, they're going to have to make a decision. The myths, or the things that Timothy was going to be teaching among them. They're going to have to abandon the desire to be the teacher. I have to be the teacher. They're going to have to abandon that if they're going to receive the commandments that Timothy would give them in order to be able to live with a good conscience. Do you have a good conscience this morning? That's actually one of the greatest spiritual blessings that Jesus came to give. Some people say, well, but if I can't see it, if I can't hold it, if I can't touch it or taste it, then of what does it even really exist? Well, we all know about the reality of a conscience and the blessings of being able to lay down if it ever gets quiet at your house, to be able to lay down, and then there's certain our mind just kind of automatically replays the day or replays some decision or something in our mind, and we wrestle with it, we sort through it, and we either think about it and then we can rest with a good conscience, or we wake up and maybe that's the first thing that's back on our mind. Do you have a good conscience? See, the commandments are given to help to produce that. Jesus came, and by everything that he said and that he did provides a way where we could have a good conscience. If we don't have a good conscience, then it usually is not difficult to understand why. There's some sin that I persist in, and I know that it's wrong, and I know that I continue to participate in it. Now, we all are going to be persistently tempted. That's not going to end as long as we're on this earth. But we don't have to be persistently disobedient. We can persistently refuse to sin, persistently resist temptation. We can't control whether the temptation is going to come, but we ought not to be persistently giving in to temptation. Or maybe it isn't that I have a guilty conscience because I'm persisting in some sin. Maybe it's I've had the help to get past those sins. I don't struggle with the things that I did. But the gospel also helps us to be aware that just because I stopped the sin doesn't mean the sin went away, or at least the guilt of the sin. And so sometimes people don't have a good conscience because they know I haven't been forgiven of that sin. And without that, the memory really does stick, even though I'm not repeating it. The memory of that and the burden of that and the consequences of that, even just within me, they don't go away. And so I'm not doing it, but it's still in me. I have that awareness. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, the blessing of a good conscience is that not only am I not continuing in it, but I can search my conscience. And notice what Paul says here, even when he was being accused. 1 Corinthians 4, verse 3, he says, "With me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I know of nothing against myself. Yet I'm not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord." So Paul says, I have a good conscience. I don't know of anything that I'm guilty of. Now, what would that mean? Is Paul saying he had never sinned? Oh no! In 1 Timothy, he's not ashamed to tell Timothy to rehearse the things he knew that he had done. He wasn't persisting in those things, but he knew that he had been forgiven of those things. He could look into his conscience. He could examine himself and say, I don't know of anything I'm persisting in. I don't know anything I have not been forgiven of. And so Paul says, if you make an accusation, if some court accuses me of something, I can stand before them in good conscience. That's not self-righteous. That's among the blessings of the gospel. Well, what's the big deal about having a good conscience? Aside from it's a lot easier to go to sleep that way. Well, the purpose of the commandment is that with a good conscience, then, love can grow there. And that's the end, that's the goal of the commandment. From a good conscience, the love of God can grow. And that's why Paul was telling Timothy to remain in Ephesus, to help that process continue. But also he adds a sincere faith. The goal of the commandment is love that sprouts out of sincere faith. Now, sincere faith is also kind of like a good conscience. There's a time where I can have sincere faith and be totally out of step with God. Saul himself, there was a time where he was like that, Saul of Tarsus. Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, he's described as a devout man. He was faithful in his home. He prayed often. He was generous with others. But he still needed words by which he and his household would be saved. So we can be separated from the love of God for some amount of time and have a sincere faith. But at some point when we are confronted with the truth, that's what the power of the truth, that's the power of the truth. It causes me either to adjust what I believe so that I can be sincere in what I believe, or I will no longer be sincere. That's what Timothy was to go and to do. If there were some who were giving heed to these things because they were deceived, and so they had a sincere faith and a good conscience in it, well, when Timothy would give them these commandments, now they couldn't continue in those things with a good conscience and with a sincere faith. Now, as Timothy goes and stresses the importance of a sincere faith, well, then there may be some people who would raise their hand and say, well, Timothy, I've got some questions about that, though. Sometimes before we can have sincere faith, we have to have some answers because we have some sincere doubt. And so Timothy might have bumped into that among some in Ephesus. Paul met people like that in Berea. In Acts chapter 17, when he spoke, they didn't immediately accept everything that he said. But you remember they searched the Scriptures daily whether those things were so. And so they had some sincere doubts. But they were not like kind of the modern agnostic of our day that, well, I have doubts, I have questions, and there's really no way to know the answer to them, so I just persist in doubt. Well, no, it's okay to have some sincere doubts, but then search for the answer. And the Bereans knew enough to search the Scriptures to find out whether these things were so. In Romans chapter 10 and verse 17, faith comes by hearing. A sincere faith doesn't automatically happen. We're not born with sincere faith. We're not miraculously given a sincere faith. Sincere faith is often the result of sincere questions, some sincere doubt. And that the way that God created us, that motivates us to look for an answer, to find an answer to the doubt. And when we find it, then there's confidence. Someone told me once, I've mentioned this example before, but someone told me that as they were growing up, they had some doubts, they had some questions, and their questions would not be directly answered by, I don't remember if it was some religious leader or someone that they just trusted and knew and spoke to. According to the person who told me, when they had doubts, what they were told is, well, he phrased it this way, fake it till you make it. The point being, well, if you don't really believe, just pretend that you believe. Act like you believe. Act like other people who believe. And if you just act that way long enough, eventually you will believe it. Is that a sincere faith? Well, no, in that very phrase, that's the opposite of it. And again, this person that I was talking to, which at the time, and as far as I know till today, he says he's an atheist, and he'll answer for himself, but maybe also people who said that will give an answer for that. You don't act like you believe. If you don't believe, if you don't know, well, then you need to find out. And we need to be people that can help others to find out, not have a fake faith, a feigned or an empty faith, but no, a sincere faith. Because when sincere questions or sincere doubts are answered, well, then the result of that is a sincere faith, and there is depth to that. And then that person with a sincere faith is now prepared to receive and then to offer the kind of love that Paul was talking about that was needed in Ephesus to help with all of those problems that were there. Is there anything that hinders your faith from being sincere, a sincere faith? Because without a sincere faith, then we can't even have the love that's described here. How do I have a sincere faith? The commandments. That's what Paul was telling Timothy to do in Ephesus. Instruct them, command them, so that they can have a sincere faith, so that this kind of love can grow out of that. And so that was the end of the commandment, the goal of the commandment. What will happen with a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith? Love will grow out of that. Well, then what? What is love going to produce? And I want to look at 5 examples of that, not in great depth, but if you look at the things that Paul wrote to Timothy, everything that he says in the rest of the book is what would happen in the life of someone who had this heart and conscience and faith from which love grew. When that love that he describes there is growing, then they're going to be prepared to wage the good warfare. Go back to 1 Timothy. I want to look at a few points in 1 and 2 Timothy that talk about this faith or this conscience or this purity. So, for example, in verse 18, Paul says, "This charge I commit to you, son Timothy, according to the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you may wage the good warfare, having" what? Having faith and what? And a good conscience. With faith and a good conscience, Timothy would be ready. Timothy would have this love, and with this love, he would be prepared to wage the good warfare. As Paul said later, fight the good fight. Well, what does that mean? Sometimes people today think those would not go together. Well, if you love, you wouldn't be fighting. Well, no, Paul says if you love, you do fight. And Paul goes right into that in verse 20. He even identifies, gives the name of 2 men that must have been known to Timothy, and maybe even there in Ephesus. That was a part of waging the good warfare. Over in chapter 4, I'll just reference a few without reading these in their entirety. But in chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, Paul wages the good warfare when he warns Timothy about man-made teachings, man inventing their own ideas, instructing or forbidding things that God did not command, that God did not forbid. And so, Timothy, you've got to go and wage the good warfare. Well, where does the motivation to fight come from? What comes from love? Where did that come from? The heart and the conscience and the faith. And where did that come from? That came from the commandment. In chapter 5 and verse 16, waging the good warfare. The context here goes all the way back to verse 3, but here's kind of the conclusion of that in verse 16. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. We live in a time where even the word church is often not well understood. And so the thought, well, but we're always the church. Well, but notice here there's a distinction between, well, in your home and your family, there's some responsibilities that you have. And your responsibility, even though he says a believing man or woman in verse 16, the believing man and woman, their work and their focus and their responsibility is different than the responsibility of the church. Oh, but aren't we always the church? In one sense, yes. In the sense of the local church, we have some funds that don't belong to my family, that don't belong to your family. As a church, we may make some decisions that are not identical to the decisions of your family, and your family makes some decisions that the church doesn't need to make. And so Paul's waging the good warfare to help the brethren there understand the focus and the work that God has given to the church. Where does that come from? Well, what we've already seen. Some people get frustrated by those teachings. Well, it's just you're overemphasizing the church, and it's just about the money. Well, it's not just about the church's money. That Paul talks about that. But then in chapter 6, verses 6 and 7 and 8, he wages the warfare on our personal approach to money. Some view godliness as a means of gain, the end of verse 5. And Paul says, no, godliness with contentment is great gain. And he goes on in some detail to describe what the Christian's approach to money should be and should not be. That's just as much a part of waging the good warfare as the other was. And then in verses 20 and 21 of chapter 6, he says, Timothy, be careful about that which is falsely called knowledge. And I've found that interesting, that our English word science comes from this same root. Be careful of what is falsely called science. Nothing wrong with knowledge, nothing wrong with science, but be careful of what is falsely called knowledge. By professing it, some have strayed from the faith. And so Paul prepares Timothy to prepare the saints to wage the good warfare. And what prepares them to fight in all these, look at all this broad spectrum of topics that are touched on. Well, Paul says all of that is the result of love, which is the result of these things we've talked about, which goes back to the commandments. When a pure heart and a good conscience and sincere faith produces the love of God, then the result of that is that we are an example, among other things, but I just picked out these two words because they fit with what we've looked at. Timothy, be an example in faith. Be an example in purity. Well, how can he be? Well, because he's pure in heart, then that should be seen in his practice. Because he has a sincere faith, then he should be an example of someone who has a sincere faith. And in what ways is that going to be demonstrated? Well, the whole book and the whole New Testament. But for example, look at chapter 5 and verse 2. He tells Timothy, especially a young man, that your conduct toward the younger women should be pure. Well, it would be pure if he was pure in heart. Then as a young man, his conduct toward the younger women would be pure. Where does that come from? All of the above. In chapter 5 and verse 22, from the commandments comes this heart and conscience and faith, comes this love, results in, verse 22, he says, do not lay hands on anyone hastily, not to grab them, but to bless them, to support them, nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. Because, verse 24, some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but those of some men follow later. And so don't share in the sins of others. Don't support the sin of others, because that's going to be revealed one day, and it may be revealed in this life, or it may not be revealed until the judgment. But don't share in that, but rather keep yourself pure. That's the goal of the commandment. Over in 2 Timothy, in 2 Timothy 1 and verse 13, he tells Timothy to hold fast the pattern of sound words which you have heard from me in what? In faith and in love which are in Christ Jesus. So the faith and the love were already established there. And the result of sincere faith and the conscience and the pure heart and then the love is holding fast to the pattern of sound words. God has a pattern, a plan of sound words for your heart, for your conscience, for your beliefs, or for your faith. And Paul says, Paul tells Timothy to tell them, hold fast to those things. Hold fast to them when nobody else is around. Hold fast to them when you're making decisions in your home and the priorities and the schedule of your family. And hold fast to them when you're making decisions among God's people as a church. God has a plan for all of those. Hold fast the pattern of sound words. And then last, in chapter 2 and verse 22. I know I'm rushing through these, but just more the purpose of giving you a bigger picture of the commandments that Paul was teaching and Timothy was teaching. 2 Timothy 2:22, flee also youthful lusts, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace, with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. And so here notice that it isn't only about you and your own spiritual growth. That's a part of the purpose of the commandment. So you need to flee some things and you need to pursue some things. But in that process, you may notice that there are others who are not fleeing those things. You may notice there are others who are not pursuing the things that they ought to pursue. And in verses 25 and 26, well then what would, if this love is really in me, and I see a brother who is going in a different direction, in verses 25 and 26, he says, then in humility, correct them. If I don't see the same heart in others, and of course I can't see their heart, but what grows out of that, if I don't see a good conscience, if I don't see the same kind of faith in me, or that is in me, if I see that is not in someone else, then if I have a sincere faith, well then I need to help someone else who needs correcting. And I need to be able to correct them in humility. What if I refuse my brother? What if I see it, but I refuse to do anything? Well then that goes back to, well, is there a problem in my heart? Is there a problem in my conscience? Is there a problem in my faith? And John talks about that in greater length, that how can I love God who I have not seen if I do not love my brother who I have seen? And so in all of this is certainly a pure heart and good conscience and sincere faith is to help us to grow. That's a part of the purpose of the commandment. But then God's intent is that then with the love that grows out of that, this is a benefit and of use for God's people, and then, of course, even the lost around us. And so God has a goal in mind for everything that He does. We can see that from Genesis to Revelation. But here in the simple instruction that Paul gave to Timothy, we see the same. God has a goal in mind for the commandments that He gave. And that those commandments do something to our heart, one way or another, to our conscience, one way or another, to our faith, one way or another. But one summary of what God's goal is for those commandments is a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith from which love can grow, in which we can grow. Take out your songbooks and think about your heart and your conscience and your faith. We have all been in a place we have gotten ourselves without God's help. We are in this place today, I suppose, because we want to offer help to each other and because we all need the help of one another. We sing this song to offer ourselves and to, more importantly, it reminds you of the offer that Jesus makes, His invitation, inviting you into Him and His Father and the Holy Spirit. Sin is the barrier, and if you know that this morning and you need God's help with that and seek God's help with that, right now or later, if there's any way in which we can help, we want to. But we want to sing this song to urge you to dwell on your heart and your conscience and your faith. And if you need to confess that faith and your need for His help, if you're ready to be baptized into Christ, we're ready to help you. If as a Christian you need to return to that heart, that conscience, and that faith, God will do that. God will help you. If we can serve you in some way in that, come tell us how as we stand and sing.